The cold porcelain of the executive washroom counter dug into Julian's ribs as he stared unblinking at the 2 red lines on the pregnancy test. Julian was a beta through and through. His medical file clearly stated undeveloped reproductive cavity in black and white, yet the sharp, phantom scent of dark rum and amber in the air made his legs weak, stirring a desperate, pathetic hunger deep within him. It was biologically impossible, a cruel joke, but the fierce, violent fluttering low in his abdomen offered ruthless proof. Cole's loss of control during his rut had irrevocably rewritten Julian's DNA. He shoved the plastic stick into the pocket of his bespoke trousers, his hands shaking uncontrollably. A beta, pregnant with the child of Wall Street's most ruthless Enigma CEO. If the board found out, Julian wouldn't just lose the career he had fought so hard to build. He would become a medical anomaly, confined to a gilded cage for the rest of his life. The washroom door suddenly swung open, followed by the chilling click of the heavy oak door locking shut. The temperature in the room plummeted to freezing. That suffocating yet utterly addictive scent of dark rum and amber washed over Julian's senses like a tidal wave, so intense it made his teeth ache. Cole stood there, casually adjusting the cufflinks of his tailored shirt. Through the mirror, his piercing gray eyes locked dead onto Julian's paper, white face. Julian. His low, unmistakably commanding voice vibrated through the air, pushing Julian's newly formed biology into a frantic frenzy of submission. You've been avoiding me lately. Julian gripped the edge of the sink, desperately trying to mask the biological tremor in his voice. Just a simple bout of gastroenteritis, Mr. Sterling. Nothing for you to concern yourself with. The blocker patch on the back of Julian's neck was damp and sticky with surging pheromones. Beneath the skin, that newly formed gland, one he was too ashamed to even touch, screamed to throw itself at the source, his jaw aching from the effort to suppress his instincts. Julian clutched the fabric of his pocket, his knuckles turning a ghostly white from the strain. Hidden beneath the wool, pressing against his thigh, the positive pregnancy test rested like a ticking time bomb, ready to obliterate his entire life. Julian forced his spine straight, locking all that turbulent biological restlessness deep into his bones. With steady hands, he slipped a pre-signed resignation letter from the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. The paper was perfectly crisp, without a single stray crease. A sudden cramping flutter struck deep in his lower abdomen, and Julian discreetly shifted his weight to the leg braced against the wall, refusing to show a single ounce of weakness. Gathering his composure, Julian met Cole's bottomless gray eyes without flinching. He pushed the resignation letter forward half an inch, his voice as cold as the frozen Hudson River in January. Mr. Sterling, since we've run into each other here, I'll hand this to you now. It's my resignation. All my project models have been encrypted and archived. The handover process is synced with HR, and I will wrap up all my duties and leave the company within 2 weeks. The aggressive blend of dark rum and amber instantly thickened, pressing heavily against Julian's chest and turning his breaths shallow. He held his posture, offering the letter. His fingertips trembled uncontrollably under the sheer weight of his restraint, yet his face remained a flawless mask of calm. Cole's gaze slid from Julian's taut jawline to the hand clutching his pocket, before finally dropping to the white cover of the resignation letter. The undeniable gravity in the room plummeted at a terrifying speed, making even the crystal chandelier set into the ceiling seem to vibrate with the tension. He slowly raised his hand, his strong, elegant fingers reaching out for the envelope. Just as Julian let out a quiet breath of relief, the crushing, inescapable domination of an enigma flooded the cold, white, marbled washroom. The intoxicating heat of dark rum and amber slipped right beneath Julian's collar, driving straight into that new, feverish gland at the nape of his neck. The blocker patch instantly went soft and sticky from the nervous sweat of his gland. A sharp cramp seized his lower belly, followed by that strange, unfamiliar flutter unique to conception, and his knees buckled on pure instinct. His knuckles went white as he gripped the positive test in his pocket, swallowing down the biological whimper clawing at his throat. His fingertips quivered wildly, but his expression stayed as cold and detached as ever. With a brutal twist of his wrist, Cole tore the sealed resignation letter entirely in half. Shreds of cream-colored paper fluttered through the air, landing on the sharp shoulders of Julian's bespoke shirt and dusting the edge of an unopened bottle of suppressants on the counter. I have fully handed over all my projects. This is a legally sound resignation. Julian's voice was so steady it lacked a single ripple, though his tightly clenched palms betrayed his absolute breaking point. Cole's pheromones pressed down with relentless gravity. His cold, hard breath brushed the flushed tip of Julian's ear, his voice low, raspy, and carrying the unquestionable authority of an enigma. Legal. Julian, I write the rules for all of Wall Street. His gaze swept over Julian's subconsciously tightened abdomen, a dark, unreadable obsession swirling in his eyes. The quarterly strategy banquet tonight. Top floor. You will be there. I already. If you even think about not showing up. Cole cut him off, his tone laced with the utter ruthlessness of a corporate predator, severing every last escape route. Your licensing with the National Finance Association, your alumni status at Harvard Business School, everything that gives you a foothold in this industry, I will strip it all away. You want to run? Where exactly can you go? To Brooklyn to serve coffee, or back to Ohio to plant corn? The color finally drained from Julian's face. He had bled for a decade to claw his way up from the bottom, and with one sentence, Cole had ended him. The gland at the back of his neck throbbed like it might burst, his body instinctively hungering for the other man's scent. A deep, visceral shame crawled up his spine. Redness flared in the corners of his eyes, but he ruthlessly choked the tears back. Cole's fingers clamped around his freezing wrist. The grip was unbreakable. He dragged Julian out of the washroom. The silver-gray doors of the CEO's private elevator slid open. A rich, impenetrable wave of dark rum and cold amber rushed out, carrying that unique, inescapable magnetism of an enigma, instantly filling the claustrophobic space. Cole's large hand was still locked like a vice around Julian's wrist. The pad of his thumb brushed against the burning skin of Julian's inner pulse point, his grip so fierce it felt like it could shatter bone. He used his body to cage Julian against the elevator panels, leaving absolutely no room for escape. The already erratic pulse of the gland at the nape of Julian's neck burned even hotter. Once perfectly smooth, the skin now swelled into a feverish contour under the relentless stimulation of high-tier Enigma pheromones. Sweat soaked his blocker patch, leaving it wrinkled, slippery, and threatening to peel off at any second. A hidden cramp seized deep in his lower abdomen, his newly conceived reproductive cavity spasmed with an unfamiliar, heavy ache. His knees went so soft he could barely stand. He dug his nails fiercely into his palms. The sharp, metallic tang of broken skin was just enough to suppress the fragile, breathless gasp clawing at his throat. This was his body's instinctive hunger for that scent, filthy and humiliating, a secret he would lock away with his life. The positive pregnancy test in his pocket dug painfully into his hip, sending sharp twinges through his side. The elevator doors slid shut. As the floor numbers climbed steadily, the enclosed space caused the pheromone concentration to spike to an almost searing intensity. Cole lowered his gaze, locking onto Julian's flushed ears. Loosening his grip slightly, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a crumpled, gold-rimmed banquet invitation, and held it out. Don't even think about hiding. His voice was a low rasp, carrying the heavy magnetic resonance of his pheromones as it brushed over Julian's feverish nape. All of Wall Street knows that Julian is my lead analyst. You will sit by my side. Julian ground his back teeth and wrenched his wrist free. His fingers trembled so violently he could barely pinch the invitation. The split second their fingertips brushed, that dominant, intoxicating rush of dark rum surged through his veins. The absolute hunger nearly obliterated his final line of rational defense. He crushed the wrinkled paper in his fist, ruthlessly choking back the biological tears welling in his eyes, leaving only a bloodless, icy mask. The elevator reached the top floor. A crisp ding shattered the thick, inescapable atmosphere. The lively, heated hum of the ballroom drifted through the parting doors, carrying a faint, sickeningly sweet scent. The saccharine aroma grew sharper, threading its way through the dark rum and directly into his senses. Julian's knuckles went stark white around the ticket. The damp, slippery blocker patch slid another half-inch down his neck. Beneath his collar, the gland throbbed and swelled, searing like a red, hot pebble that sent relentless waves of numbness down his spine. The penthouse ballroom was showered in crushed gold from the Swarovski chandeliers. The room was packed with the elite power players of Wall Street, dripping in designer silk and expensive perfume. Their low murmurs snapped to a halt. Every eye in the room glued itself to the two figures at the elevator. Standing by the reception desk was Tristan. Dressed in an ivory suit, his blonde hair flawlessly styled, the cloying sweetness poured directly from his exposed gland above his collar, so dense it was suffocating. He walked over with a bright smile. His gaze swept over Julian's instantly drained face, lingering for a deliberate half-second before he smoothly wedged himself between Cole and Julian. The concentration of his intentionally released pheromones doubled in a heartbeat. The aggressive scent violently triggered Julian's newly conceived biology. A harsh cramp seized his reproductive cavity, the heavy ache shooting down the small of his back. His knees went so weak he nearly collapsed, forcing him to dig his nails even deeper into the broken skin of his palm. He pressed fiercely against the pocket, holding the positive test, hunching his shoulders slightly to hide the slipping blocker patch at his collar. Relying solely on the sharp sting in his hand to anchor his last shred of sanity, he kept his breaths agonizingly shallow and slow. The inescapable magnetism of Cole's dark rum and amber caught the air, brushing against Julian's wrist. The primal craving nearly demolished his walls. Turning his head away, Julian whispered in a trembling, ice-cold breath, "I'll find my own seat." But the moment his Adam's apple bobbed, a wave of intense nausea violently flipped his stomach. His newly altered, pregnant biology rejected the foreign omega scent with brutal hostility. All color vanished from his lips, and a sickly, pallid hue crept into the corners of his eyes. Low whispers rippled across the room. Every gaze was locked onto the trio. Tristan paused mid-motion as he looped his arm through Cole's. Offering a sweet, delicate smile to the crowd of prying eyes, he lazily slipped 2 fingers into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded, heavy sheet of paper. The fractured light from the chandeliers caught the unfolding cream paper. The bold text, 98% ultimate pheromone compatibility, was blinding. The glamorous room went dead silent for half a second, followed immediately by muffled collective gasps. For a top-tier Enigma to find a match over 90% was a once-in-a-century miracle. 98% was an absolute guarantee of a destined legal mate. Dropping his shoulders softly, Tristan leaned closer into Cole's side. The cloying, overwhelming waves of champagne rose pheromones were swept deliberately toward Julian in the corner, searing so hot that Julian's nape violently flinched. He leaned hard against a freezing marble pillar. His internal biology spasmed in tight, relentless waves, his knees so weak they could barely sustain his rigid posture. "Julian, I was going to wait until after the banquet to announce it with Mr. Sterling." Tristan smiled, the corners of his eyes flushed pink. His voice was soft enough to drip honey, yet the barbed words struck straight at the jugular. "You've worked here for so many years after all. Who knew you'd cling so desperately to the center stage? You're just a beta with no gland. You couldn't possibly be delusional enough to think you could take the place of an Enigma's mate, right?" Whispers instantly flooded the high-ceilinged ballroom. Prying, disdainful, and pitying stares pierced Julian like a barrage of tiny needles. He gripped the broken skin of his palms tightly. His lips were as white as rice paper, the corners of his eyes sickly pale from biological agony. His sanity was desperately clinging to his last shred of dignity, but his chest ached fiercely. The primal, desperate craving for dark rum and amber was about to tear through his throat, while the acidic churn in his stomach was already surging wildly up his esophagus. Julian had no time to entertain the sneers, pity, or schadenfreude of the surrounding guests. Pressing his knuckles brutally against his lips, he turned sideways, shoving past the silk-clad bodies blocking the aisle, and practically bolted for the terrace. The sickeningly sweet champagne rose pheromones clung to his collar like spoiled molasses, impossible to shake off. Every breath he took made his newly formed reproductive cavity cramp violently. His glandless nape erupted in an agonizing phantom itch. It was the instinct carved into his bones by the high-tier Enigma pheromones reconstruction. It screamed relentlessly for the cold scent of dark rum and amber. It screamed for the man who had dragged him out of his quiet beta life and thrown him into this mire. His stomach was terrifyingly hollow. To suppress the morning sickness, He had only sipped half a glass of ice water before leaving the house. Now, gripping the biting cold marble railing of the terrace, he doubled over, dry, heaving. Only clear, acidic fluid dripped from his pale lips onto the leg of his dark gray tailored trousers, blooming into a small, dark stain. His knuckles turned stark white as he gripped the balustrade. Dislodged by the violent motion of his bending over, the clinic slip he had kept hidden in his pocket for 3 days drifted lazily through the air. It landed onto the polished teak flooring of the terrace, unfolding just enough to reveal the bold black text, Obstetrics Consult. The low murmurs at the ballroom entrance abruptly cut out, every whisper caught in their throats. Dozens of shocked stares pinned themselves to the paper resting on the floor, the guests barely daring to breathe. A pair of flawlessly polished ivory Oxfords, accompanied by a thickening, cloying cloud of champagne rose pheromones, came to a slow stop right beside the delicate clinic slip. Tristan bent down. His perfectly manicured fingers pinched the flimsy slip, his thumb dragging deliberately across the paper. When he looked up, his meticulously groomed eyes brimmed with vicious amusement. I wondered who was hiding out here retching. If it isn't our firm's most high and mighty beta analyst, Julian. The guests who had trailed after them instantly erupted into hushed chatter. The rustling sneers pricked the hyper-sensitive skin at the back of Julian's neck, triggering an agonizing, phantom itch. An obstetrics consult? Tristan deliberately raised his voice, waving the slip under the crystal chandelier for everyone to see. The champagne diamonds on his fingernails caught the light in a dizzying flash. How fascinating. A beta born without a gland with an underdeveloped reproductive cavity, booking an appointment with an obstetrician? Malicious laughter erupted. Some gasped, while others whispered entirely too loudly, did he sleep his way to the top? Betas are just expendable labor anyway, and he still doesn't know his place. Can he actually get pregnant? Isn't that a freak of nature? Julian's empty stomach cramped with sharp pain. His legs went weak, forcing him to press his spine ruthlessly against the freezing marble balustrade. He wanted to snatch the paper back, but his throat seized, choking off every word. His newly formed reproductive cavity spasmed in tight, rhythmic waves, draining every ounce of strength from his body. Tristan stepped closer, leaning in to hiss directly into Julian's ear. His cloying pheromones slithered into Julian's open collar. You don't actually think getting pregnant is enough to take my place, do you? You're just a cheap beta. Even if an Enigma's presence altered your biology, you're nothing but a backstage plaything. Don't ever delude yourself into thinking. Before he could finish, a heavy, resounding thud echoed from the massive mahogany doors sealing off the chilled air of the ballroom. As the heavy doors swung open, an explosive wave of dark rum and amber, carrying the biting chill of a Manhattan midnight, crashed over the terrace. The undeniable domination of a top-tier Enigma instantly blanketed the space. The suffocating, sickeningly sweet champagne rose pheromones that had choked the air were obliterated in a fraction of a second, vanishing like a popped balloon. Still clutching the crumpled clinic slip, Tristan's knees buckled uncontrollably. He hit the freezing terrazzo floor with a heavy thud. He braced himself against the stone, trying to look up and defend himself, but the absolute dominance crushing down on his omega gland was agonizing. His breathing fractured into ragged gasps. He trembled violently, unable to force out a single syllable. The Wall Street elites crowding the doorway to watch the spectacle instantly scrambled back 3 steps. Their faces drained of color. They held their breath, swallowing even the urge to cough. No one dared cross Cole Sterling, and absolutely no one expected the utterly ruthless CEO to lose control in such a public setting. Julian leaned against the freezing marble balustrade, his already weak legs trembling even harder. He pressed himself ruthlessly against the stone, his pale fingertips resting lightly over the slight curve of his lower abdomen. He was fully prepared for the Enigma who controlled everything to publicly discard him. After all, he was just an expendable beta who had no business carrying an Enigma's child. But Cole's gaze never once dropped to the trembling figure on the ground. Those deep eyes, usually masked in frost, were now bleeding with a turbulent, volatile crimson. The collar of his bespoke suit was yanked open, his tie hanging askew. He looked like an enraged apex predator protecting his territory as he advanced on Julian, step by calculated step. Yet, entirely on instinct, the aggressive edge of the dark rum pheromones softened. The scent wrapped gently around Julian's trembling shoulders, quietly and seamlessly soothing the rhythmic spasms of his biology. Completely ignoring Tristan shaking at his feet, Cole's vision locked with lethal precision onto the crumpled slip still crushed in the Omega's grip. He reached down. With effortless ease, he slid the ruined clinic slip from Tristan's fingers. The excruciating weight crushing down on the Omega's gland instantly doubled. The cloying champagne rose scent was obliterated, as if crushed and kicked into the gutter. Tristan couldn't even manage a scream. His face was practically pressed against the freezing terrazzo floor, his shoulder blades trembling so violently they looked ready to shatter. Cole didn't spare him so much as a fraction of a glance. His thumb brushed past the faint champagne stain on the edge of the slip. With casual precision, he folded it twice and slipped it into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket, pressing it directly against his beating heart. The moment he turned around, a blazing, suffocating wave of dark rum and burning amber swept across the entire venue. Muffled gasps echoed from behind the glass doors. The financial titans crowded inside didn't dare breathe too loudly. Everyone knew that drawing the attention of an enraged top-tier Enigma was a fatal mistake. Julian remained pinned against the freezing marble railing. The faint curve of his lower abdomen was barely concealed beneath his loose black shirt. His legs felt as hollow as water, logged cotton. He lifted his eyes, his lips pressed into a bloodless line, entirely devoid of the energy to offer a single word of defense. A second later, arms radiating searing heat swept behind his knees and across his back. Cole lifted him effortlessly into the air. Julian's body instantly went rigid, snapping tight like a drawn bow. His shoulders trembled uncontrollably. Without thinking, his fingertips hooked the silk lining of Cole's suit lapel, only to instantly recoil as if burned. Cole carried him down the hallway lined with thick cashmere carpets, his leather shoes making absolutely no sound. He kicked open the solid wood door of the exclusive VIP lounge, the frame hitting the wall with a low, resonant thud. The room was already saturated with a faded, comforting trace of dark rum. The turbulent cramping in Julian's abdomen instantly eased another fraction. Softening every movement, Cole carefully and meticulously lowered Julian onto the plush, handcrafted Italian leather sofa. The cushions sank under his weight. Julian's fingertips were still trembling where they gripped the armrest. Slowly, Cole raised his hand. His elegant, prominent fingers drifted deliberately toward the patch covering the flushed, pale, pink skin at the back of Julian's neck. The entire VIP lounge was utterly saturated with Cole's Enigma pheromones. It carried the undeniable magnetic dominance exclusive to the absolute apex of power, yet mingled with a nearly imperceptible tenderness, slipping straight down Julian's collar and seeping deep into his bones. Every single cell in Julian's body was screaming, starved for the pheromones radiating right in front of him. Yet, the deep-seated inferiority carved into him by society's strict biological hierarchy dragged his sanity straight toward the abyss. He violently flinched backward, his shoulders hitting the backrest of the leather sofa with a heavy, muffled thud. Without warning, a tear shattered against the back of his hand. It was staggeringly hot. From the moment he had stepped foot into this elite investment bank, Julian had always been the flawlessly calm, utterly detached senior risk analyst. In this singular moment, every last ounce of his armor fractured and fell apart. "Don't touch me." His voice trembled uncontrollably. He looked up, the corners of his reddened eyes clinging to shattered tears. Yet, driven by a sharp, reckless despair, he screamed until his voice cracked. "I'm a useless beta. Take a good look. I was born without a gland, without a reproductive cavity. I'm just mediocre, expendable labor, without even the biological right to be claimed. Haven't you always seen betas as nothing more than tools for the grind? So why are you touching me now?" Cole's fingertips stopped dead in midair. The cold, hardened brow that had just radiated overwhelming hostility suddenly drew tight. A torrential storm surged within his deep, ink, black pupils, and the suffocating Enigma dominance instantly dissipated. His Adam's apple bobbed hard. Slowly, his hand fell to his side, only to reach into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit. His knuckles brushed against the pristine, bespoke wool lining, retrieving a worn, polished black velvet box. His prominent, elegant fingers flicked open the lid. Inside rested a cool gold signet ring engraved with the Hoffman family crest. He had kept it warm for years, letting it absorb his exact body heat. In the very next second, the Enigma CEO, who stood at the absolute apex of Wall Street's power, dropped to one knee on the cream-colored hand-woven cashmere rug right in front of the violently sobbing Julian. The volatile, storming pheromones of dark rum and amber softened in an instant. Every sharp, aggressive edge was smoothed away, replaced by an almost reverent tremble that gently wrapped around Julian's cold ankles. Cole's jaw was taut, the corners of his usually frostbitten eyes visibly red. When he spoke, his voice was as rough as sandpaper. 5 years, Julian. That downpour at the Harvard Alumni Association. When you crouched by the fountain to help me gather that blown-away M&A draft, your jeans covered in mud, and you laughed and said, "Investment bank paper is more expensive than gold." I wanted you right then. He lowered his eyes, his thumb brushing over the raised crest of the ring. The 5 years late truth crashed into Julian's mind, leaving him reeling. During my rut that night, my rivals tampered with my state, but I deliberately drew you into the penthouse suite. The biological rewrite wasn't an accident. I intended to shatter every damn hierarchical rule and make you mine. This ring is the token of the Hoffman heir. I've carried it for 5 years, just waiting for the day I could put it on you myself. Julian leaned back against the leather sofa, his swollen eyes wide open. His dying, shattered heart felt as though it had been fiercely gripped by a warm hand. Even the suffocating ache carried a surreal sweetness. The hand that had been fiercely digging into his palm slowly unfurled its tight fingers. Bearing half-dried tears and the raw sting of broken skin, he slowly lifted his trembling hand toward the cool gold ring suspended before him. In Julian's blank mind, all the inexplicable coincidences from the past 5 years suddenly threaded together. That faint, barely there, scent of dark rum during late-night overtime wasn't his imagination. The way Tristan's cloying, testing pheromones would inexplicably dissipate wasn't a fluke. And that rainy night 2 months ago was never an accidental intrusion into an Enigma's territory and rut. It was an orchestration 5 years in the making, flawlessly designed to seamlessly pull him into this man's world. Cole's thick, inescapable blend of dark rum and amber gently enveloped him, completely purging the cloying champagne rose scent that had lingered in his sinuses. The persistent phantom cramping in his newly formed reproductive cavity slowly eased into a soft hum, the panicked loss of control vanishing entirely. Tears spilled over again, splashing onto the back of Cole's bare hand. Julian finally touched the cool gold ring, carrying Cole's warmth. The engraved ridges of the Hoffman family crest brushed against the raw, split skin of his palm. Raising a hand that shook so hard he could barely hold on to anything, he slid the ring onto his ring finger. The fit was absolutely perfect. This man had calculated everything, etching even his ring size into memory long ago. Cole's Adam's apple bobbed heavily. His historically cold, rigid jawline trembled with tension. He leaned in to wipe the tears from Julian's face, the pad of his thumb gently brushing the swollen corners of his eyes. His breaths were agonizingly light, terrified of shattering this hard, 1 second. They quickly smoothed out their rumpled clothes. Under the crystal chandelier of the VIP lounge, the cool gold ring on Julian's ring finger gleamed with a deep, quiet luster. Cole's elegant fingers wrapped around the lounge's metal door handle. Just as he was about to push it open, a wave of noise from the banquet hall slipped through the crack of the lock. It carried an unmistakable, sobbing voice that crashed right against their eardrums. Cole's thumb brushed the raw, split skin of Julian's palm. The soothing pheromones of dark rum and amber wrapped gently over the injury, instantly suppressing the lingering biological discomfort. "Let's go." Julian smoothed the creases of his suit cuffs. The blocker patch on his nape was secure, and his gland, steadily shielded by Cole's pheromones, was left in a state of tranquil relaxation. The violent, overwhelming loss of control from earlier had completely dissipated. He looked up, his eyes resting in their usual calm, with only a lingering trace of red at the corners, and gave a slight nod. The moment the wooden door of the lounge swung open, The cold light of the crystal chandeliers crashed down. The wave of whispers across the room snapped to a halt. Hundreds of gazes instantly nailed themselves to their intertwined arms. Dead center on the main stage, Tristan's eyes were red and swollen. Clutching the crumpled, forged pheromone compatibility report, he leaned half his body weight against the arm of the chairman of the board. His voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. "Board members, I genuinely don't understand. Why would Julian bully me like this, just because I'm the Omega destined to be engaged to Mr. Sterling? He pushed me on the terrace, told me I didn't deserve a place in this firm." A flurry of hushed, fractured chatter erupted across the floor. The gazes of several veteran board members aimed at Julian were already laced with the disdain reserved for a beta who shouldn't covet top-tier resources. Others shook their heads slightly, thinking that an expendable grunt from the bottom daring to steal an Omega's place was an act of pure arrogance. Tristan cried even harder. "I built the core data for those projects. I just wanted to stand by Mr. Sterling's side." Cole didn't say a single word. His arm remained locked firmly around Julian's waist. The freezing, undeniable Enigma pheromones flooded across the marble floor, instantly crushing the cloying champagne rose into an imperceptible speck. Without breaking his stride, he walked straight up to the central control panel of the main stage. The cold metal of the USB drive slid into the port. Cole's elegant hand didn't pause for a fraction of a second, pushing it all the way in. The massive projector screen flickered, throwing a pale blue loading bar across the room. The sheer tension instantly pulled the air in the crystal ballroom terrifyingly taut. Tristan's hand, fresh from wiping his tears, froze against his cheek. The suffocatingly sweet champagne rose pheromones wavered. The gland at the back of his neck began to throb uncontrollably. The dark rum and amber that Cole had blanketed over the room was already crushing his breath, but now an icy premonition crawled up his spine, making his very fingertips begin to tremble. Julian stood half a step beside Cole. His breathing was even, the only sign of strain being his pale knuckles gripping the hem of his suit jacket. Beneath his flat abdomen, that hidden presence stirred gently, reacting to the enveloping warmth of the man beside him. Julian ruthlessly forced down every trace of the biological anomaly. The room was packed with Wall Street's financial elite, titans who had clawed their way to the top over decades. The buzzing whispers from moments ago instantly evaporated. The only sound left in the air was the faint, crystalline clinking of the chandelier beads. Hands holding champagne flutes froze in midair, drinks forgotten inches from their lips. The second the loading bar finished, the first slide flashed onto the massive screen. The red seal of a private Manhattan clinic was glaringly clear, detailing Tristan's 3-year prescription history for high-tier synthetic Omega pheromones. The notes section read with damning clarity, used to falsify pheromone compatibility. A collective gasp erupted across the ballroom. Tristan's face instantly drained of color, turning as white as ice. He stumbled back a half step. "This is fake. Julian forged this." The words had barely left his mouth when the screen cut to high-definition security footage of the executive corridor. Late at night, 3 months ago, Tristan was seen swiping a stolen keycard to enter Julian's office. The footage of him crouching by the server terminal to copy data was so crystal clear that even the designer logo on his cuff was visible. Immediately below the video, a flawless string of system login logs and file extraction records cascaded down the screen. Cole turned his head, his gaze sweeping over Julian, whose breathing had grown slightly uneven. When he turned back to face the crowd, an inescapable earth-shattering Enigma dominance crashed down, instantly suffocating every breath in the room. The alphas in the front rows subconsciously recoiled half a step. The gland at the back of Tristan's neck throbbed so violently, it looked ready to tear through his skin. His cloying champagne rose pheromones had long since shattered, leaving only a panicked, sickly, sweet stench hanging in the air. His face was ashen. His lips trembled so violently he couldn't squeeze out a single complete sentence. The weeping, victimized facade he had just presented to the board was entirely obliterated. Cole finally parted his thin lips. His voice was bone, chillingly cold, every syllable crashing down on Tristan like a physical blow. "The compliance agreement you signed upon hiring outlined the penalties for breach of contract very clearly. specifically for the theft of core trade secrets and the falsification of identity credentials. No, Cole, I was wrong. I lost my mind for a second. Tristan crawled forward like a madman, desperate to grab the hem of Cole's trousers. I faked the compatibility report. I stole the data. I've followed you for 2 years, please. Just let me go. Cole shifted his foot half a step away, denying the Omega even the chance to touch his clothes. He lifted his chin toward the security guards at the door, then his voice rang out across the room with absolute finality. All unvested options and equity incentives under Tristan's name are hereby voided and destroyed, effective immediately. A collective, muffled gasp ripped through the crowd. Those options, converted to dollars, bordered on 9 figures, wiped out in a single breath. 2 men in black suits strode over, hauling a completely limp Tristan up by his arms and dragging him out. His hysterical curses and wails scraped raw across the grand ballroom. The security guards vanished through the ballroom doors, though Tristan's frantic curses still seemed caught in the carved crevices of the crystal chandeliers. The elite titans of Wall Street stood frozen to their cores, keeping their breaths half a beat too shallow. No one dared to be the first to speak. After all, having just exposed a fraudulent Omega who stole corporate secrets, absolutely no one could guess what the Enigma at the absolute pinnacle of power would do next. Cole turned away from the control panel. The sound of his bespoke leather shoes pressing into the hand, woven wool rug was agonizingly clear, striking right against everyone's chest. He walked straight toward Julian. Cole didn't say a word. He simply reached up and slipped off his tailored dark gray cashmere suit jacket. The fabric, carrying the faint, inescapable magnetism of his dark rum and amber, was draped securely over Julian's shoulders. The hem fell perfectly, shielding the still, hidden curve of the pregnancy concealed beneath Julian's shirt. The entire room sucked in a sharp breath. The fractured whispers were instantly suppressed to an absolute minimum. Cole couldn't have cared less about the collective shock. Bending his knees slightly, his warm hands loosely gathered around Julian's waist. There, under the intense gaze of hundreds of eyes, he lowered his head and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to the flat abdomen beneath the suit fabric. In that exact moment, every ounce of Julian's tension shattered. The past 2 months of shame, panic, and the agonizing fear of discovery were entirely dismantled by that single, tender kiss. The dark rum pheromones rippled out with incredible softness, soothing every frantic, unnatural craving in his gland, and ironing out the deep, hidden creases of his 5 years of silent devotion. Julian raised a trembling hand, his fingers burying into the soft hair at the crown of Cole's head. Taking the family signet ring Cole had given him, he slid it securely onto Cole's ring finger. He had accepted a love meticulously orchestrated over 5 years, and in return, he surrendered his entire soul. The fractured light of the chandelier fell over their intertwined hands, the bronze ring reflecting a warm, muted gleam. The grand hall remained dead silent for 2 seconds, before applause slowly rippled out from the board members' seats. A soft, enveloping warmth surrounded the embracing pair. Resting his head against Cole's solid chest and breathing in that deeply familiar scent, Julian finally closed his eyes, offering his very first unburdened smile in 5 long years.
The story ends here. I don't really like Julian calling himself a useless beta, a mediocre expendable, without even the right to be claimed. He is clearly so outstanding. He graduated from an elite university, and in just 5 years, he fought his way from the bottom to the position of chief analyst on Wall Street. That kind of resume is absolutely stellar. Yet, Julian was still so deeply insecure. In my eyes, he could have shined so much brighter. So what if a beta gets pregnant? With his own strength, Julian could easily support the child himself and give them a wonderful life. Aside from that insecurity, however, Julian handled everything else perfectly. He has immense self-respect and sharp judgment. The very first thing he did after discovering the pregnancy wasn't using the child to cling to power, but immediately preparing his resignation, determined to raise the baby alone. Cole is a commanding enigma with an absolute desire for control. He fell for Julian the very first time they met. I can't help but guess that Julian ending up working by his side was entirely Cole's doing. Perhaps this guy had planned everything from the start, luring this little lamb right into his territory. The accident during his rut was also a premeditated move to force his feelings for Julian out into the open. He just didn't expect Julian to choose to run away. Feeling out of control for the first time, Cole could only resort to forcefully threatening Julian's future to make him stay. Honestly, if it weren't for Tristan's deliberate sabotage, I don't know how Cole would have managed to keep Julian. Because of Tristan's bullying, Cole got the chance to play the hero and smoothly found the perfect opening to confess. It just goes to show, arrogance and dominance will only push your lover away. Only gentleness and a willingness to bow down can win their embrace. If you enjoyed this story, remember to hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.